Well, maybe in the interest of time, we'll get started and hopefully more people will join us. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our third webinar in our series of 4. My name is Sonia Bloom. I am the Communications and Environmental Coordinator with Foothills Forage and Grazing Association. I'll be your host for today. I've been with the Southern Alberta Grazing School for Women for 3 years, and I'm really excited to host. The following virtual grazing school series of webinars are being brought to you by both the Alberta Range Stewardship course and the Southern Alberta Grazing School for Women. We are hoping to provide content and reach grazing audiences across Alberta, and because of that reach, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in and on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory, traditional territory of many First Nations across Alberta. If you're participating from another location, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories you are in. We also acknowledge the Métis Nation and many other First Nations whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and millennia. That long relationship includes both experience and knowledge gained and a deep and strong sense of connection to the land, water, and wildlife. Thank you to those from those nations that are here today. Oh, there we go, sorry. All right, so just a little bit of information on the 2 groups that are responsible for putting on the presentation today. The Alberta Range Stewardship course is a cooperative initiative of several organizations, including beef producers, and has roots in the Stockman's Range Management course, offered across Alberta in the past. It provides an opportunity for livestock producers and professionals to come together to share information, expertise, and provide valuable knowledge and skills. Our goal, as we share experiences and information, is to keep ranching operations sustainable, economically, but also socially and environmentally. It is offered throughout Alberta and is 1 to 2 days with a combination of indoor and hands-on field learning. This will be the 4th year, but held online due to COVID-19 limitations. The Southern Alberta Grazing School for Women is currently in our 18th year. It brings together rural women to network and share experiences and to develop and enhance ranch and farm management skills. The school is always partnership-based and is hosted each year by various counties or municipalities, government agencies, nonprofit groups from across Alberta. Core topics covered annually include range and riparian health, hands-on plant identification, grazing principles and practices, and we usually hear from local ranching women and their stories. Every year, new relevant topics are covered. The 2 groups decided to team up in time of COVID and offer these webinars instead of the usual in-person workshops because there's a lot of complementary content that we would normally offer in person. So it's a very exciting partnership. Now, before we get too far into this, we'd like to hear a little bit about yourselves. If you don't mind, please fill out the poll. We'll give you a couple minutes and it just gives us an idea on who's on the call today. Okay, we'll check that out in just a minute here. In the meantime, just a little bit of housekeeping. So today's presentations will be roughly between 45 and 50 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes afterwards for questions. These presentations are also being recorded, so you'll get a chance to go back and watch it again if you're interested. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Your mics have been muted. If you're having troubles hearing or other technical troubles, you can use the chat box, which is, you can see that little blue circle at the bottom of your screen. Your questions, please make sure you put them in the Q&A, which is in that little red circle. Do not put the questions for presenters in the chat. It just makes it hard for us to find them all at the end. We will officially be ending things at the hour mark, and the presenters will stay online for just a little bit for discussion and more questions if anybody would like. So let's see what those poll results were. There you go. So we can see that we have quite a few producers on the call today, which is really exciting. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you get a lot of value out of these. There we are. All right. So here's the committee members for the people who are responsible for bringing to you guys the presentations today. So these are both members of the Alberta Range Stewardship course and the Southern Alberta Grazing School for women. Today's presentation is on weed ecology, control, and species of concern in Alberta. Our first presenter today is Catherine Tarasoff. Dr. Tarasoff has spent the majority of her professional career working within farming and range systems. Catherine is passionate about thinking outside the box when it comes to research and providing the tools needed to effectively manage weeds in our managed systems. She received a PhD from Oregon State University in crop science and rangeland ecology, with an emphasis on weed science, and went on to become the invasive plant ecologist at Michigan Technological University. Dr. Tarasoff recently moved back to British Columbia and runs her own consulting company, specializing on-farm research and invasive species management. Catherine holds an adjunct professor position, at Thompson Rivers University and teaches sessionally within the Sustainable Ranching Program at TRU Williams Lake. After Catherine finishes, we'll hear from Megan Evans. Megan began working with invasive species during her time with the Provincial Forest Health Team. While there, Megan oversaw a regional invasive plant management program, implemented education and outreach initiatives, and was responsible for survey and control of forest insects and disease. She then worked as an ecologist with Alberta Parks, where she established an integrated vegetation management program. Megan was a board director for the Canadian Council of Invasive Species Council and the Entomological Society of Alberta, and is the founding president of the Alberta Native Bee Council. Megan is currently the executive director of the Alberta Invasive Species Council. So without further ado, Catherine, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Sonia. Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about approach to weed management, which I like to call holistic weed management. Oops. So I want to start by reviewing integrated pest management, which is our really it's our standard way of dealing with invasive pests. So they can be weeds, they can be rats, they can be anything. And in this presentation, I'm really focused on plants. Just a second here. So IPM is a decision-making process for managing pests in an effective, economical, and environmentally sound way. So I underline the word process because I think it's a little bit ironic that it's a process, yet most of us are familiar with the IPM house model, which is there on the right. So this is the US Department of Interior's house model that most of us have probably seen. Everything is built on blocks, and the foundation of the house is all about the biology of sort of tools that you can call into action. Mechanical, chemical, prevention, cultural, and biological. But after 25 years, I like to think of IPM in a different way, which I call holistic weed management. So we're going to go through this, what I think is more of a process in our way of thinking about weeds on our property or the land that we manage. And we're just going to go through this flow chart in this presentation today. So the most important way to start is by establishing goals. And if you're managing a farm, I don't mean financial goals. I mean sort of ecological or production-based goals. And so it's important, this is something that can be done at your table, in your kitchen, anytime. You can look at a Google Map type image and just look at the parcels on your property and the different ecosystem types and decide for yourself, what's the goal for this site? So on your hay fields, Is it that you want grass forage, alfalfa, mixed hay? And when you're establishing your goals, you need to be thinking, how am I going to measure this? So you might say, I want 4 tons to the acre off of this field, or I want, to get 3 cuts off of this field. Out on the range, it could be, I want improved range condition, but what does that mean to you? How will you measure that? If you have a wetland, it might be, I want to improve diversity on this wetland. I want this to be my sort of my ecological hub for my farm. Maybe if you have a stream or some kind of a creek running through your property, you might want to stabilize it and to have it stop flooding, or the banks to stop slumping. So what are the goals for all the different parts of your land that you manage, and how will you measure if you're reaching those goals or not? And it's really important that you focus on what you do want rather than what you don't want. So most of us don't want weeds, and that's fine, but what do you want? And then how will you know that you're getting there? These are important first steps. So it's also important that you walk the property. So the next step in our cycle is prevention and monitoring. So when you get out to the field, you walk your property and you sketch a map and identify areas that are infested versus areas that are not infested. So the first goal of this program should always be preventing the problem from happening in the first place. A weakened plant community is susceptible to invasion. So when you have healthy areas, it doesn't mean that you get to forget about them and say, that's great, it's healthy, I can walk away from it. No, you still have to keep managing those healthy areas and monitoring them, because keeping healthy areas healthy is a lot easier than trying to deal with areas once they get invaded with weeds. So you walk a map, you walk your site and you sketch a map of where you have weeds, where you don't have weeds, and then you critically assess your current practices. I think that everybody probably understands that weeds are a symptom of kind of an unhealthy, broken ecosystem. And I know that we all inherit former land managers' practices, but it's important that you critically assess your practices. Are they sustainable? Are they contributing to or creating a problem? And it's important to understand the kind of the sustainability of the land and make sure that you're falling into a sustainable land practice. Oops. So once you've identified that you have weeds in a certain area, it's really important that you know what this plant is that you're looking at. Correct ID is so critical. Understanding the biology of the weed is what's going to give you the options in your toolbox for how to deal with it. It's important to know, is it a grass or broadleaf, annual, biennial, perennial, taprooted, fibrous roots? These things are important. A taprooted plant is really easy to pull out. A fibrous rooted plant is really difficult to pull out. Does it produce through seeds or asexual reproduction? If it fragments and has rhizomes, then you know that, so that you don't do a land management practice that will spread it, like tilling. So there's a whole bunch of questions that you can ask yourself. It's also really important to observe where you see it growing. Dry sites, compact sites, wet sites, gravelly sites. These will give you a little bit of an insight into possibly what its competitive advantage might be. So I like to say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Understanding the biology of weeds really helps you to understand if it has an Achilles heel or if it may be taking advantage of some environmental condition. So you combine your knowledge of the weed with the ecology of the system. And that's where I was talking about just on the last slide. So what are the soils of your area? Is the soil condition favoring your weeds? Sorry. If the soil is compact, that may be giving your weeds a competitive advantage? What's the precipitation and growing conditions of the area where you see weeds? Is the soil moisture condition favoring the weeds? Many weeds are very drought tolerant. Are the nutrient conditions favoring weeds? Many weeds are also very poor nutrient tolerators. And then are you able to manipulate the conditions through things like irrigation, fertilizer, and any amendments that you can make to the soil condition to improve soil health? So when you overlay your goals for the area and you overlay where you see weeds on your property, and then you overlay the ecology and the soils of your sites, you'll start to see patterns emerging. And those patterns should give you a clue as to what land management conditions are leading to invasive plants or weeds on your property. Of course, you'll have some special things like you may have salty soil or saturated soils, things that may make management challenging. And those are important to consider because those may be sites where you just say, I can't change this. This is always a saturated site. But otherwise, you will be able to see a pattern forming on your landscape, and you should start to see how the weeds are associated with ecological or environmental parameters, and those are also maybe linked to management practices. And you may also be able to tie in your goals and see priorities for treatment. So when you're developing your treatment options, we have these 4 treatment options: biological, chemical, mechanical, and cultural. I don't actually put prevention in with my treatment options because prevention for me kind of falls into cultural, but it also falls into just sort of the first step, not the now that I have weeds step. If I had weeds, I wouldn't be preventing them. And many of us are familiar with these 4, but I make cultural the big bubble, and I'll talk about why. So we have our other tools, which I'm not going to talk a lot about. We have biological, mechanical, and chemical. So biological is using any living organism, can be insect biocontrol, it can be goats, it can be cows, sheep, to control weeds. Mechanical is equipment to control weeds, can be our own equipment, like our hands pulling the weeds out of the ground. It can be mowing, can be weed eating. There's tilling, many different mechanical options. And then many of us are familiar with chemical treatment, natural and synthetic pesticides to kill or alter the growth of weeds. These are the other tools that we're familiar with, but the one I'm going to focus on is cultural. This is what I call the big bubble. And this is using really land management tools to make the environment unfavorable or inhospitable for weed reproduction, dispersal, and survival. It's important that we all remember that every square foot of the planet is covered in thousands and thousands of weed seeds. And when we're thinking about culturally managing our land to make it unfavorable for weeds to germinate, survive, reproduce, and disperse, we remember that plants need 4 things to survive. They need water, soil, sunlight, and space. And I mean physical space, not atmospheric space. So we want to prevent weed seeds from having access to these 4 critical resources that they need to survive. We want to make sure they cannot touch the soil, that they can't access soil moisture, that they don't have enough sunlight to grow, and that they are physically limited in space through competition of the desirable plant community. So every plant has an Achilles heel, and every plant has a competitive edge. And we want to tip the ecosystem in favor of our desirable plants. We want to give our desirable plants all the competitive advantages that we can. And we want to understand the Achilles heels, not just of our weeds, but also of our desirable plants. If your desirable plant is really susceptible to overgrazing, then it's important that you are gentle with your grazing. If your weeds are very, very drought tolerant, then it's important that your soil never goes too dry, or that you keep the soil health and the organic matter high enough that it can retain soil moisture that does come through the ecosystem. So when we tip the ecosystem in favor of our desirable plants, then we find that our desirable plants are able to compete quite effectively on their own against invasive plants. When the ecosystem is tipped in favor of invasive plants through things like overgrazing or just disturbance or reducing the soil health, then the invasive plants are sort of it's tipped in their favor. So there's many different examples of things we can do to practice cultural weed control. Things like reducing a disturbance through reduced grazing, through if you practice fire on your land, to be well aware of how that fire is affecting your desirable species. We can reseed with competitive species when we do have disturbance. Practice cover cropping, mulching. There's many tools to improve soil health, and the list goes on. I just want to show this one example from a farm I was at recently, and they had bale grazed up on this kind of dry ridge on their property. And so I've circled here in red one of the spots where they had bale grazed, and all back here is diffuse knapweed. All around here is diffuse knapweed, and diffuse knapweed is a very drought tolerant invasive, and it's really taken off on their farm this year because we've had such low moisture in the Kamloops area. But here where they bale graze, and this is just one site, there's many examples like this on her farm, the grass is coming in really green. There's barely any diffuse knapweed in here, and the soil moisture is higher under this bale grazed area than out here where she didn't bale graze. So this is an example of cultural weed control. Many of us might not think of bale grazing as a weed control option. Many of us might think of it just as a soil health builder, but by having better soil health, you also have a more robust community that can indeed prevent invasive species. So it's when you come up with your tools that you want to try using, it's important to realize that they're not exclusive of each other. So one of the things with the IPM house is that the pillars are structured like they're independent of each other and that they don't overlap, and that you almost have to choose one over the other, and that the pillars are all equal in height and strength, and that's just not true. Some tools are going to be better than other tools for the job, and those tools can also complement each other. So when we establish our BMPs or our best management practices, we're just using our best sort of guess based on the logic that we've gathered and based on our understanding of the biology of the weed and the ecology of the ecosystem. So in this example here, I have a field that's really densely infested with spotted knapweed. There does seem to be some residual grass community. So we could start, or we've got all these different tools, and we're not really going to start with one or the other. So we can use biocontrol. So we have a root feeding weevil here. We could introduce that root. That root weevil spends 95% of its life underground, using the root for habitat. So because we've got this root feeding weevil that's underground most of the time, we could run goats through as well to bite off the tops of the plants and reduce seed production. So those two can live quite sort of they can cohabitate easily with one another. Now, those two are treating the bulk of the infestation. We still need to treat the perimeter. So we could spray or we could mow the perimeter to stop the weed community from spreading. We could bale graze all over here to build soil health and possibly to reseed through the bale graze, through the bales, or we could reseed manually. As the napweed starts to come down, we can reseed it. We could use water if we needed it to improve germination of our seeds. So you can see that all the tools can be used together. You don't have to choose one or the other. After you've chosen your tools and you've implemented them, so that's your best management practices, and you've implemented your best management practices, it's important to monitor them. So monitor it and see, is it helping me reach my goals? Remember in the very beginning at your kitchen table, you sat down and you established goals for different areas. Well, after you've implemented these tools based on an understanding of the biology of the plant and the ecosystem of where it's growing, it's important to revisit those sites and use the tools for monitoring that you set out in the beginning, and then put those into action and decide, am I reaching my goals or not reaching my goals? Often change happens slowly, so it may take many, many years, but you want to see that you're moving towards reaching your goals, even if it's slowly, that you're moving in that direction. And some final considerations at the end here is, of course, we can't go out and treat all of our land all the time. That's just often just not feasible. So you want to prioritize your efforts based on a few things. If you have multiple overlapping land uses and values, and when you put all your goals and your land uses together, some spots are going to really float to the top as being super high priority for treatment. And so that's important to recognize that some areas just have a higher priority just because of your land uses and your values for those sites. The other thing to consider is what's the likelihood of spread if you do nothing? Some weeds spread outrageously. Other weeds just sort of seem to hang out in one spot and they don't really move a lot. So that's important to recognize. What's the risk of spread if I do nothing to these particular weeds? And then what is the difficulty of future treatments if I do nothing? Some spots are really difficult to access, time consuming to access. And so if I don't treat it now, while the weeds are still small and in their just infancy of establishment, it's going to get significantly more difficult in the future to treat if I don't treat now. So those are just some final considerations when you're prioritizing where you're going to put your efforts. And that's the end of my presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, great presentation. A couple things really stuck out to me. One in particular was talking about how you still manage those healthy areas, and the fact that just because it's healthy now doesn't mean that we should take for granted that it'll always be healthy. That monitoring of those areas is really important. So I think that was something that was definitely key for me. Megan, if you're ready, I'll let you take over from here.
You bet. Okay. How does that look? That probably looks so great. Thanks, Catherine, for the thumbs up. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I've heard all about the Grazing School for Women and these great range stewardship courses, so it's really exciting for me to be able to be a part of this year. So thanks for the invite. So I'm Megan Evans. I'm the Executive Director of the Alberta Invasive Species Council. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to start my timer. Here we go. Before I do anything else, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Alberta Invasive Species Council, about the organization, what we do, what resources we have available to you as land managers, give you a really brief introduction on invasive species in general, Then we're going to focus in on just a few invasive plant species that are of concern on Alberta's rangelands. And then I'm going to arm you with some great resources to help you identify invasive species and manage them in the future as well. So we'll be kind of training you on resources that you can use to help yourself with your management efforts in the future. So the Alberta Invasive Species Council is a nonprofit organization. We were established in 2006, originally as the Invasive Plants Council. We expanded our scope in 2013 to include all invasive species taxa, and we've been going strong ever since. So we have a large board of directors, which means I have lots and lots of bosses. There are 16 of them, and they come from a lot of different backgrounds. So we've got board members from industry, academia, government, other nonprofit organizations. That makes us a really strong organization with a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds. We currently have 3 staff. One is part-time and 2 are full-time, and our funding comes from a variety of sources. So some of the resources that we have available to you are things like our website. So I would encourage everybody to check out our website. It's abinvasives.ca. But we have information on all different kinds of invasive species. There's all kinds of information, photos, etc. We also have information about all of our other programs on our website as well. So one of our programs is our EDMAPS app. So EDMAPS stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. So this is an invasive species reporting app that's a free download, and I'll talk about EDMAPS a little bit more later on. If you're interested in downloading it, this is the icon here. This like burgundy colored pin is the icon that you're looking for when you're looking for the EDMAPS app. We also have invasive species fact sheets. So we have almost 200 different fact sheets that look kind of just like this spotted napweed one. So there's photos, a bit of an overview and history, identification, all the descriptions on how to identify them, as well as information on how to control them. So these fact sheets are just a tremendous resource, and there's loads and loads of them on our website. We also have information about our biocontrol release program. So we offer biocontrol release agents for different invasive plant species, including Dalmatian toadflax, Leafy Spurge, hound's tongue, spotted and diffuse knapweed, and Russian knapweed. And we're working to coordinate and revitalize, breathe a little bit of new life into Alberta's certified weed-free forage program. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So I think before we talk about invasive plants, it's really important to recognize that invasive species do come in all different forms. So we of course have invasive plant species, and I think we have way more invasive plant species currently present in Alberta than we do any other type of invasive species, certainly any other type of regulated invasive species. So on the top here, you can see blueweed. This is a pretty bad blueweed infestation. I live in the Crow's Nest Pass. A joke that this is the municipal flower of the Crow's Nest Pass. Not everybody finds that funny, but we have a lot of blueweed down here. We also have aquatic invasive species, like invasive plant species, like flowering rush and yellow flag iris. So these are plant species that grow in or near water, which of course makes managing them very difficult because your control options become much more limited. Then we have invasive fish species like carp and goldfish. And I'm not sure if you guys have seen any of the news articles lately. We have a major problem with goldfish in Alberta. There are goldfish in most of our stormwater retention ponds across the province because people are releasing their aquarium pets, and that's a big problem. And we won't get into that today. There's, of course, aquatic invasive mussels like zebra and quagga mussels, and I'm sure you've seen the boat inspection stations where people are required to stop and have their boats inspected because we want to keep Alberta's waterways free of these mussels. We have invasive diseases, invasive insects, invasive fungus. So this is you can see this pine branch on this pine tree, and there's actually an introduced fungus that is the leading cause of mortality of our 2 endangered pine species that we have in Alberta. So these things have lots of implications. And we have invasive mammals like these feral pigs. So wild boar at large are a major problem on the Canadian prairies in Alberta. Their populations are growing, and they're considered to be one of the most damaging invasive species on the planet. And so we have them here, the populations are growing, they're a big, big deal. And so if you see any wild boar, we want you to report them. So let us know if you see them. We have a new campaign, it's called Squeal on Pigs. You can check out the details about that on our website as well. So the impacts of invasive species, I saw there's a lot of producers here today. You guys know the impacts of these invasive species. You know how they can come in and devastate the local ecosystems. They outcompete overcrowd native species, results in a loss of biodiversity, a loss of food and habitat for wildlife, loss of ecosystem function, which is a big deal if you're a producer. You need that ecosystem function. And those environmental impacts translate into economic impacts. And so there's loads of different numbers out there, depending on what you want to look at. This is a good one. This was an old estimate now that researchers estimated invasive species are costing Albertans $1 billion every year. And the majority of that's attributed to costs associated with invasive plant species. So weeds are no joke. These things are really damaging both to our environment and our economy. And they spread with everything that moves on the landscape, helps facilitate their spread through different pathways. So quads and vehicles are a major pathway. This is the undercarriage of a quad on the top right-hand screen. So for anybody that, everybody here probably drives a quad for their work or for to manage their land. This is really easy to accumulate this kind of debris in the undercarriage of your quad. And not only do you not want to be spreading weed seeds, you also don't want this to catch fire. So clean this out before you move to a new site. Have a look at your equipment and come clean and leave clean. Again, here's an RV with a bit of a bush attached to the bottom of it. I took this at the Fast Gas in Frank. Now, I don't know what this plant is or if it poses any real risk, but again, it potentially could. And this is one thing that you want to be considerate of. Industry opening up new access roads can be a major pathway. Hikers, wildlife, cows, my dog is a major pathway, vector of spread of invasive species. And of course, we have other factors like wind and water as well. So we have, I mentioned earlier, we were revitalizing, breathing new life into the Alberta Certified Weed-Free Forage program. So contaminated hay is another major pathway that invasive plant species can spread. So if you're interested, if you're a producer or a potential buyer of certified weed-free forage, we currently have about a dozen counties that are participating, and you can find out who they are on our website. But if you're interested, call your county office and ask for a weed-free forage inspection if you're a producer. The inspector will come out, they'll walk your field, and they'll either certify all or part of your field as certified weed-free based on the conditions. And then it's the field needs to be cut within 10 days and baled with special twine. And we will help you sell your certified weed-free forage. We will advertise it, we will promote it, and we'll keep a list of all producers with inventory on our website as well so that buyers know where to find it. We want to see more weed-free forage on the market in Alberta, and we're here to help with that. So if you have any questions about that program, please let me or your local ag fieldman know. Okay, so we're gonna jump into our plant identification. I think we're doing pretty good for time. Before we do, there's just a couple of bits of terminology I want to go over. And now this is probably old hat for all of you, but I want to make sure we don't leave anyone behind. So, and as Catherine was saying, it's really important that you understand the biology of the plant. And that's why I drive home these plant life cycles. And even though I think everyone probably knows what these mean, we go over it anyway. So an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle in a single year. So the seed germinates, the plant grows, it sets seed all in 1 year. A biennial completes its life cycle in 2 years. Typically, that's going to result in what we call a basal rosette. So it's a cluster of leaves right on the surface of the ground in the first year. And then a flowering stalk that comes up in the second year. It goes to flower, it sets seed and dies. And then perennials are plants that live for more than 2 years. And there's a lot of these plants that are like biennial to short-lived perennials, etc. But this is an important consideration for how you're going to control those plant species. And then we're going to go into a little bit, the only real bit of terminology with regard to the plant identification is the leaf arrangements. And so this is super basic, but the understanding the leaf arrangements and what they're called is really helpful in identifying what you're dealing with if you don't know what it is. So first we have alternate leaves. So that's when you go up the stem and then you've got one leaf going off of one side, then you go up a bit further, there's a leaf going off the other side on alternate parts of the stem. And you contrast that with opposite leaves. And so opposite leaves are when you go up the stem and then you have two leaves coming out of the stem at opposite sides of the stem at the same location. You go up a bit further, same thing. Then we have whorled leaves, and these are like opposite leaves, but they have 3 or more leaves coming off of the stem at the same point. And again, just the alternate opposite thing is really important terminology when you're identifying plants. So I have 8 different invasive plant species. The first 7 are all quite common throughout rangelands in Alberta. And then the last one's a bit of a new invader that Catherine over in BC might be more familiar with than we are, but one that's up on our doorstep. So the first plant we'll talk about is Leafy Spurge. And I'm sure some people are very familiar, probably more familiar with this plant species than they care to be, but this is one that we have a lot of in Alberta. It's a perennial, so it lives for many years, and it spreads through both creeping roots and seeds, which makes it very challenging to control. It has a milky latex that can be toxic to livestock, which is a problem if you're a producer. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. And it has this unique, very unique looking flowers, these yellowy green flowers that are not even actually flowers, but they look like flowers. So you're not likely to really confuse this with much of anything else. And you've got these long, narrow, waxy leaves that you can see on the bottom image here. So this is Leafy Spurge, very common rangeland weed, and very can take completely over your system if you don't keep an eye on it, and it is a challenge to control. So next is spotted knapweed. So spotted knapweed is growing. I think I see more knapweed every year here in Alberta. So this is a biennial to short-lived perennial. So this is one of those ones that lives for 2 years, maybe a little longer. It spreads by seeds though, only seeds, and it has a large taproot. So this is one you can get a lot of joy from, satisfaction for if you're pulling spotted knapweed and you can get that full taproot. So it has purple flowers. Flower color is a terrible characteristic to go off of though, because there's always variability. So you can see these purpley pink flowers that can be quite a bit darker, and they can even be white as well. Here's a first year spotted knapweed rosette on the upper right corner. So, I mean, it's difficult to see the leaves, but they're very dissected. These leaves and these leaflets, but this is your typical first year spotted knapweed rosette. Then you get the flowering stem, and then again, the stem leaves look very similar to the rosette leaves. I find this plant very hard to see unless it's in flower. And so that's why I've got this bottom picture here, which is of the spotted knapweed skeleton. So that's last year's growth that died. And if you have spotted knapweed present, you'll see these skeletons first. And then you start having a look for your rosettes and having a look for your flowering stems as well. So it's important to look for previous year's growth if you're looking for doing a bit of a survey for invasive plant species. So again, I mentioned that it spreads by seeds only, which makes it a little bit easier to get a handle on, but it's such a prolific seed producer. So I've read somewhere that spotted knapweed can produce over 140,000 seeds a year. So removing the seed source can be really effective. So deadheading, things like that can be really effective with this. But yeah, this is a big problem. So there are a number of knapweed species that are regulated in Alberta. Spotted knapweed is by far the most common. And if you're interested in differentiating between your different knapweed plants, you really want to look for these things called the bracts. So this is a spotted knapweed flower head before it's flowering. And here you can see these bracts you can see it circled here. And they're this brownish black color, and it makes the flower head look spotted. And that's how it gets its name. So this is how you would identify spotted knapweed, and you look for other characteristics in those bracts to differentiate between the different knapweed species. Okay, so we're going to move right along. I'm going to next talk to you about our two different toadflax species. So the first is Dalmatian toadflax. So this is a short-lived perennial, so it lives for more than 2 years. It reproduces by both seed and rhizomes, and the rhizomes on these plants can be intense. And they're always very interconnected underground. Both of the toadflax plants have these very distinctive butter and eggs, snapdragon-y like flowers. They're very beautiful, and the flowers are almost identical. How you can differentiate between the two is by having a look at the leaves. So Dalmatian toadflax has these heart-shaped, broad, stout leaves. And you'll see that they grow in an alternate manner on the stem. So this is Dalmatian toadflax, and here's yellow toadflax. So this is in the same genus. It's very closely related. Here's those same snapdragon-y flowers. And here's the leaves, though, which are very, very different from the ones we just saw in Dalmatian toadflax. So they're very narrow, very linear, and you won't differentiate the two if you can see the leaves on the plants. So again, dealing with another perennial, reproduces by both seed and underground rhizomes. So those are the underground root systems, and can be challenging to control because of that. Okay, so next is the yellow flowered hawkweed species. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background here. These get tricky, and there's a lot of them. So there are, I believe, 11 different invasive yellow flowered hawkweed species currently present in British Columbia, many of which are on our doorstep. In Alberta, we have at least 2, but as many as 4 of those invasive yellow flowered hawkweed species present. It's very difficult to differentiate between the different yellow flowered invasive hawkweed species, but it's very easy to identify that you have a yellow flowered invasive hawkweed species. And for management purposes, in my opinion, that's all you really need to know, because these are incredibly invasive, incredibly problematic if you don't get a handle on them. So only 2 of these yellow flowered hawkweed species are regulated in Alberta. 2 of the most abundant ones that we have here in the province are not regulated. But as a producer, as a land manager, I would treat them as regulated species and control them as best I could, because you will lose production on your land if you let these guys spread. So these are perennials. They're going to form this basal rosette that you can see in the bottom corner here. And the leaves on the basal rosette are all degrees of hairiness. It depends on the species that you're dealing with. And the hairs and the way the hair grows and the type of hairs are the characteristics that you're typically going to use to differentiate between the different species. So it'll send up the flowering stalk. And as you can see here, the flowering stalks are almost leafless. So the stems have almost no leaves. And if they do have leaves, they'll be at the very base of the plant. And then this little black cluster of flowering the flower head is very distinctive for the invasive hawkweed species. Whoops. And then you'll see that those flower buds open up to produce these yellow flowers. And they're all at the top of the stem in clusters as well. So we do have native hawkweed species. And if you're just looking at these basal rosettes, you could be very confused. The main identifier that I use to differentiate between the native hawkweeds and the invasive hawkweeds is the presence or absence of stem leaves. So the invasive hawkweeds have very few, if any, stem leaves, and the native hawkweeds always, in Alberta, always have stem leaves. So if you're dealing with one of these flowering stalks and you see stem leaves coming off the stem, you're dealing with a native hawkweed. And if you don't see any stem leaves, you're dealing with an invasive hawkweed, and you want to kill it. It's these are very prolific. These plants are easy to kill, but they spread so incredibly quickly. It's very challenging. The other thing that's really important to note, if you have a flower that looks that's not quite flowering yet, like these black kind of flower heads here before they bloom, and you pull that plant, throw it on the ground, the plant will put every last little bit of its energy into going to seed, reproducing. So if you throw that flower on the ground, you come back the next day or 2 days later, it will have gone to seed. So even just deadheading these plants and bagging them, removing them from the site can be really effective, keeping in mind it's a perennial, so they'll come back next year unless you pull it, etc. So really challenging species group to deal with, and these are only going to be they're a growing problem here in Alberta. And we have more. There's orange hawkweed as well. And so orange hawkweed obviously is differentiated by the flower color. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful orange flower. Again, it's a perennial. Orange hawkweed reproduces by seed, rhizomes, and stolons. So those are those above ground runners that like you see in strawberry plants, right? So they're throwing everything at reproduction. That's what makes them such a good invasive plant species. And so you'll get your basal rosette. It looks exactly like the yellow flowers. Again, there's differences in the hairs on the leaves, but in this case, you have an orange flower. Really, really aggressive invader. I've seen places in BC and in Newfoundland where these things have taken over lawns, natural areas, and just formed these dense mats of these basal rosettes, and nothing else is growing there. So it's a really, really problematic group of species. If anyone is interested, if you'd like to know more about the species that we know that are present in Alberta, we've got a bit of a cheat sheet here, and I can send this around to the organizers to send out to everyone else. There's nothing formal about this. This was created a few years ago by Alberta Agriculture or Environment, the government of Alberta at the time, and this is really helpful if you're needing to differentiate between the species, which again can matter because only some of these are regulated. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about Downy Brome, and I'm going to wrap things up here really quick. So Downy Brome is an annual grass. So this is different. All of the other invasive plant species that we talked about were forbs or broadleaves. And that means that your selective herbicides are potentially going to be effective on them. Well, your selective herbicides are not effective on grasses. So this means that Downy Brome can be a little bit more challenging to control. You don't always have an unselective herbicide with you. And if you do, it's not always the best option for controlling Downy Brome because you'll wipe everything out. So this is also called cheat grass, and it's called that because it germinates earlier than the native plants and cheats them out of the nutrients and soil moisture before those native plants kind of wake up or germinate for the year. So it's a winter annual, and it reproduces by seed only. So it's an annual, it completes its life cycle in 1 year, and seed is the only way it's spread. So if you remove the seed source and pull your Downy Brome or cut it or remove the seed source, you can be really effective in controlling it. It's just a real pain to do because this is a very tiny plant. There's a lot of plasticity in how it grows. So if there's a lot of soil moisture, it'll be really tall. And if there's not a lot of soil moisture, you'll see them just very, very short. And this species is adapted to frequent fires. So you can see that there's a lot of litter here on the ground, and they'll burn quite quickly, which is problematic for the native plants that aren't adapted to that frequency of fires. Finally, the last species that I'm going to address is Sulfur Sinkfoil. So this is a perennial. It looks very similar to a lot of our native sinkfoils, and it reproduces both by seed and vegetatively underground. I bring this up. So this one is not prevalent in Alberta yet, but it is on our doorstep. We've had one report of it in MD of Ranchland, one report of it in the Crow's Nest Pass, and some in Waterton. But what you want to look for is the pale colored flowers, the lack of stickiness, and hairs that protrude at 90 degrees from the stem. So I'll wrap up real quick with just a couple of resources that you can use to help identify invasive plant species. So we have 75 regulated invasive plant species that are all regulated under the Weed Control Act. And if you want the list of species, you have to find the Alberta Weed Control Regulation. That will give you the Latin names and the common names of all 75 regulated species. We have a photo gallery and invasive species fact sheets on our website, which is abinvasives.ca. And there's an Alberta Invasive Plant Identification Guide, which is a downloadable PDF, and you can also get print copies if you're interested. There is an app for this as well, and this is my last slide, Sonia. You'll be happy to see that as we're running out of time. We have the EdMaps app, which I mentioned earlier, which is used for reporting invasive species. We get the reports, we send them off to the local authority for follow-up, where all reports go into provincial distribution maps. But you can use this even if you have no interest in reporting invasive species, because they're jam-packed with photos, descriptions, and distribution maps, so that can help you with your ID. There's also an Alberta wildflower app. So if you don't know what you're looking at, there's just as good a chance that it's a native species as it's an invasive species. So check this one out. This is an interactive identification key. It's a free download. Then there's also this picture, this app, which I just discovered. It's changed my life. So this is the one where you take photos of the plant and it'll give you an identification. It's not always accurate. Keep that in mind. It works well for some groups of plants and less well for others. But this is a really good way to get started with this picture, this app. So those are some really, really great resources. And here is my contact info. I always get told that you folks should follow us on social media. We have some great social media. So if you're a social media fan, find us there. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. I just wanted to bring up the point that I in my past life, I used to be a weed inspector, and I can personally attest to how devastating orange hawkweed can be in people's fields. I've seen it absolutely take over, and yeah, you're right. It's beautiful, but it's also terrifying.
Yes.
So of the day, and we have a few questions here. So I believe the first one is for Catherine. The question is, you mentioned using bale grazing. Are you only using this on introduced communities? And isn't there a chance of bringing in other unwanted species through bale grazing?
Right. Yeah. Great question. So bale grazing is used in BC. It's used across all kinds of plant communities, from, putting the bales out on your pastures to putting it out in your native range condition. And yeah, you do have to be very careful with what you are baling up and what you're putting out. There's lots of different reasons that people do bale grazing. There's the weed one, which is really just part of a holistic approach. And the other thing I've seen people doing is in areas where they have a lot of shrubby plants in the understory of trees, because in BC, 90% of our range is forested. We don't have a ton of this open, sprawling grassland range. They'll actually stick bales in the understory of trees to force cows to go in there and trample all the shrubs and sort of knock back the woody vegetation. And then that releases more of the grass forage in the future. So, and you know, ironically in BC, to the best of my knowledge, we don't even have a certified weed-free forage program. So I'm really excited to talk to Megan after this, because it's been one of those things I really want to get going. But back to your original question, yes, you can be introducing problematic plants depending on where you're putting your bales. So you need to be aware of what's in your bales, and you need to be cognizant of that. In many cases, people intentionally want some plants that have gone to seed because they use the waste from the bale to reseed areas. If you have 20% waste and there's lots of plants that have gone to seed, then those plants will reseed areas. But if that's not what you want, then don't use bales that have gone to seed. So that's a great question, and that really comes down to understanding what's in your bale and what are you using it for, and using it effectively.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Next one is also for you, Catherine. Are there mixed cover crops you recommend for late season planting for winter cover, or species that will germinate in dry conditions in August in Alberta?
You know what? I'm ashamed to say I have done zero work in Alberta except for a couple of summers at Lake Louise. So I'm really not very familiar with the Alberta climate and the plants that are recommended for forage. I would spend some time talking with the resources that are available. Like in BC, we actually go to the seed suppliers a lot to ask them about different seeding recommendations. But I do think it's important for those cover crop species. There's some attributes that you can definitely use to your advantage, like a nitrogen fixing cover crop. There's great resources out of the States on cover cropping. So just look south to what they're doing in the US and see what cover crops are being recommended just below the border, because of course, borders are just a completely arbitrary thing that we've stuck on the landscape. If you look south to see what the US is recommending, they are often advanced in their research and their practices. And then think about what is it that you are trying to get from your cover crop. So I did do an interesting study out at Rock Creek with a producer. Rock Creek is a very dry, difficult piece of land in BC. And this producer had about 90 years of conventional forage production. The ground was so hard that you couldn't even get like a soil penetrometer in more than 2 inches deep, and you just hit this just like cement. It was so hard. And so for his cover crop, we put in tillage radish. And the idea with tillage radish, not a nitrogen fixer, but the radish root is big and it like punches holes in the soil like Swiss cheese. And so his goal was that he wanted to use the cover crop to hopefully, you know, get rid of some of the weeds problems he was having, but also he wanted to punch holes in the ground so that that very limited soil moisture that he had with snow melt, because he had no irrigation, dryland farming, he wanted that moisture to actually get in the ground and not just run off. So we had a twofold goal from his cover cropping. One was to stop soil erosion and not just have the ground sitting bare all winter, but the other one was to punch holes in the ground to get that soil moisture in the ground, and it worked really well. I mean, some of the tillage radish roots were still growing sideways once they hit that layer, but he was starting to punch holes in the ground. He was starting to increase his soil moisture from those tillage radishes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you want more follow-up, Megan, with resources, then let us know, reach out to us, and we can help you with that as well. I believe this one is for Megan. The question is, can you suggest control measures for narrow-leafed hawksbeard in a 9-section native pasture field? Oh, Megan, looks like you are, muted.
Sorry.
That's
So I saw that question and had to do a little bit of research because I've never dealt with narrow-leafed hawksbeard myself. So the first thing I did, so I've never managed that plant species. I am familiar with it, but I looked at what it was. So it looks like, based on my quick Google search, which wasn't super scientific, it's an annual and it spreads by seed only. So this comes back to Catherine's presentation where she talked about your first question you asked yourself, what is the biology of this plant? So it's an annual and it spreads by seed. So that tells you that you need to get a handle on that seed source, and that's the most critical factor. So you've got two options. Basically, you can hand pull or even till to remove the plants. But again, I recommend hand pulling when feasible. You said it's 9 acres or 9 sections or something, so maybe not feasible. But removing, bagging, and removing as much of the seed source as possible can be really effective. And there's also chemical control options as well. And I would reach out to your local ag fieldman to ask them what they'd recommend as a herbicide if you're willing to use that route. If you have a large infestation, you're probably going to have to use some herbicides. Keeping in mind that if you need to spray it before the flower head is produced, because they'll likely go to seed after they're sprayed as well. So again, getting a handle on that seed source, combination of deadheading and a chemical control could be really effective. But understanding the biology of the plant is the first step. Invasive species, we don't have any resources on that species actually either. So that's a good one for me to make note of, and that it's a problem in other areas. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Megan. And then we have another one here. The question is, I have gas people coming on my land. Should I ask them to hose off their tires before they drive onto my property?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. So yes. I'm jumping up and down. Please. It's your property. You set the rules. Tell them they need to come clean and leave clean. Like, remember the undercarriage of that quad? That was a government range agrologist who brought their quad to quad training. So we all know better. And if you have control over your land, you enforce those rules, and absolutely ask them to make sure they're putting this clean when they arrive, right down to their work boots. We have a campaign called Play Clean Go. It's kind of goofy, but that's really kind of the sentiment around it, is that come clean and leave clean. And that doesn't matter if you're recreating, if you're working, whatnot. The single most effective way to manage invasive species is to prevent their establishment in the first place. It is the biggest bang for your buck. And yes, 100%, if anyone is coming onto your land, ask that they come with clean equipment and clean boots.
Perfect. Great answer, Megan. I feel the same way. All right. So next it is, we have one more presentation coming up. It's this Thursday, and it's on the producer perspectives. So we're really excited to have Kyle Forbes and Jeanette Brown join us for that one. And lucky, I'm the host for that one as well, so you get to see me again. We do want to take this time to say thank you very much to our sponsors, FCC and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. They've provided us financial support for these schools, and we really appreciate that. Part of what helps us is the evaluations. So you will be getting an email after the event asking for your feedback on the events. This information is not only important to us as committee members, but also to our sponsors, so that we know if the information we're providing is useful, and a whole range of other information. We'll also be sending out more resource opportunities, so keep your eyes open for those emails. Once again, thanks to all the committee members for putting together these events, or for these webinars. And again, one more big thank you to both Megan and Catherine for your fantastic presentations today. There's lots of information provided, and I think a lot of people say that it was useful, so that's excellent. For everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you on Thursday's presentation.